Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm here with my good friend, Officer Reilly, for a conversation I have been really eager to have and get you on the podcast, my friend. I think we've been talking, and I've been nudging you about this for a couple of years at this point. Reilly and I met a few years back around the idea of trauma-informed policing. And we're going to dive into that topic in great detail on this episode. And I cannot wait for our conversation. But before we jump into it, Officer Reilly, please introduce yourself to our listeners.
All right. So I am Officer Reily. I am a police officer for a department in the Denver metro area. More, I guess, personally, I grew up in Colorado in Boulder County. And I got my undergraduate degree from the Metropolitan State University of Denver with psychology, in psychology rather. And then I went to the University of Denver and got my master's in clinical social work. And through my social work program, I created an independent study where I looked at a multidisciplinary approach to law enforcement. And that was kind of after my passion for law enforcement was reignited after I dated a guy who is also a police officer, and he and I are no longer together. But through my experience with him going through the process of getting hired through whatever agencies, it was really stressful. So then, not only for him but for me, and so then. I ended up shifting more towards wanting to work with families and partners of individuals in law enforcement. And then I wasn't so sold on doing marriage and family counseling. So I created that independent study. And during the calendar year of 2014, and then give or take a little bit, I did 14 ride-alongs with Denver police. So I compared and contrasted the similarities and differences between law enforcement and social work. And then graduated, tried social work jobs, was not my cup of tea. So then I sat in the parking lot of a restaurant and I applied for the police academy, and which is ironic. And then I put myself through the academy, went and worked at a small county jail in the mountains, and then I wasn't there for very long, but boy did I learn a lot.
Yeah.
And from there I went to patrol, working for a local police department.
Awesome. So one of the reasons I just love our conversations is your, there's so much talk right now about the kind of maybe a balance between policing and social work. And is there a different way to sort of look at this? So I think you holding both of those perspectives are just in a unique position during this really, stressful time, I think, for all of us around, this topic. And so I want to jump into a lot of things, but the one that I thought, and what I loved about our conversation, and it started a little bit around homelessness, and we've sort of expanded it out more to a concept of trauma-informed policing. And words that, I see together a little bit, but it's kind of like nobody 7 or 8 years ago was really talking about trauma-informed schools, for example, and now it's sort of all the rage. So I think, when we started our conversation, I Googled it, and there was very little out there in the realm, and as everything in trauma-informed grows, this grows a little bit. But I wonder if somebody that kind of holds the understanding of trauma like you do through through both experiences. The words trauma-informed policing, what just in general do you think that sort of looks like, and what would that look, trauma-informed maybe policing, look like that's different than maybe some traditional models?
Yeah, I love this question so much because it is so challenging.
Yeah.
It's not an easy one to answer, and I think for me it means so much, but it can be such a simple practice, right? So how I see it is that it would be, we need to be aware of and comfortable in our own traumas when we go into situations where we are, as an officer, I'm called into somebody's worst day of their entire life.
Yeah.
And if I haven't wrestled with, and if I haven't come to terms with my own traumas, I'm going to be even more triggered. I can either make the situation worse or I can be better. And it all depends on how I handled my own trauma. And then if I am aware of that, I can set that aside, or I can at least try to set that aside as much as possible. And then I can bring as much resources and regulation and de-escalation into the situation as possible, knowing that, this person isn't just crazy or evil or psycho or whatever it is that these negative things can be described in these situations about these people, but rather there is a source and there is a root to why this person is acting this way. And so by being understanding of what trauma is for me and what it means for other people, it can ultimately, I think, calm the situation so much. Mm-hmm. And so being trauma informed simply means that I'm aware of myself enough to be able to help those in need.
Whew, that was even better than I thought you were going to give us. So let's talk about, because one of the powerful things, as I've come in and trained your department and trained, that was the first department I trained, though I've had a lot of police folks in trainings I've done in the past. And one of the things that I just came away with out of these experiences is kind of twofold question here. One is, police aren't exempt from experiencing childhood trauma. So when we talk about the adverse childhood experience study and all those things, just like us in the mental health profession come from that, but police bring that piece into it. But one of the things that I was just really blown away from with a couple of days of training I've done with your department was the level of trauma experienced in the job. Hearing stories about one of the younger officers who I hadn't really heard the term suicide by police, but before this conversation, and just the story after story after story, sometimes coming from an individual officer, that any one of those stories would have been the most intense moment in my entire life. And yet I was a little worried that none of this had really been worked through, if that's the right word. Like, it's just kind of a normalized, it kind of like when I talk to folks in the military, it's like they talk about going out on patrol and where's the sniper, where's the roadside bombs, and they just kind of chuckle about it. And I'm like, holy, like I couldn't believe it. So I kind of wonder, as you look at your fellow officers, and you've shared some of your own experience with me as well, how do you see both of these things coming together of folks who may not, like so many folks, police aren't unique in this, are carrying their own past trauma into the work, and then just the trauma from the job at the same time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't know where this comes from or what the resource is, but I've heard that an officer who's been in the job for 3 years has experienced the same amount of stressful situations or traumatic situations as the average 75-year-old.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I don't know. It's something that when we go into the job, we think it's going to be one thing, and then it ends up being something different, right? Like, so you buy a house and you're like, oh, this is fun and this is great. And then you're like, no, this is very stressful. Everything breaks.
Where
Some
do all
like,
the mice come from? Yeah.
why are there mice in my house? Like, I feel like that's probably one of the best analogies that I've been able to come up with, is like, you buy this thing and it's this huge, exciting, like life-changing event, and you buy into it, and mentally and emotionally you think you're prepared, and then all of a sudden you're sitting in a room with a woman who is screaming and crying because her son is dead and he's 10 months old. And these are things that you can never prepare for. They try to in the academy, but you cannot, you just can't prepare yourself for the things that you'll see and experience. But they assume that since you were willing to, you spend 6 months in the academy at least, you do a 10-month to 1-year hiring process, that by the time you get to that point, and then you're in a field training program for, I don't know how long that is either, because I blacked that out because it was but like, we go through years of preparation, and nothing ever prepares you for the trauma you experience. And then, thank goodness, nowadays it's less of a suck it up buttercup mentality, and we're kind of getting away from those archaic ways of policing and supporting each other. Like, peer support groups didn't used to exist, and that's why I feel like some of like suicide kills more police officers than any other way of dying. And so we have to be overly aware of the stress, the terrible things that come with this job. And then we have to figure out how to, in our own heads, figure it out personally, without, it spilling over to the people that we love. So.
Yeah. Will, and as I prepare for your training, and I just think, what's in the news now just has really maybe just think very deeply, in our friendship and conversations have just been, I always appreciate your patience for me coming to you and saying, Reilly, I've got some ideas, I've got to run it by you, kind of thing. But one of the things that really I just worry about from all sides is that, historically, from what I've read and from our conversations and just my experiences, that there's almost been, as there are in a lot of arenas, that getting your own and asking for your own mental health services has a stigma around it, whether it's a machismo or whatever is that for barrier to saying, hey, I'm a human being, and I just, like the experience you said, had to sit with a mom who's just lost her child. Help. I'm always big. Where's the box I put that in to be okay and go on my shift again tomorrow? So on one hand, you have and I think research bears this out in your statement about the 3 years. You have in many ways a traumatized force. Maybe not everybody is actively traumatized, but just the story after story I've heard. I didn't hear a lot about, and I spent 3 years in therapy to be okay now, right? There's kind of like, and some of the officers admit, we know what to tell the psychologist to get back in the car and out on the shift. And yeah, I love the honesty, because it's just right. Nobody was lying to me in the hallway. It's like, I'm really screwed up, but I knew what to tell the psychologist to get back out. So there's all of this admittance. So you have at least a force, maybe the average officer, under at least an intense load of stress. Then there's the experiences, and I use the term memory for this, or re-traumatization, of some of the stories you've told me about, pulling someone over and realizing they have a warrant. Luckily, your gut told you to call backup, finding out they had a weapon and, probably the intent and purpose to use it if you didn't call for that backup. I just kind of put myself in your position. I'm like, when does the next traffic stop that I do, I don't think the next person is going to try to hurt me as well. And so that that fear is just such a natural thing that if an officer doesn't have it every day, that's pretty remarkable from a psychological perspective. And then we have this flip side in so many communities that again, I think is being vocalized in different ways now, of that police are also a trigger for a lot of people as well. So my whole thing that I don't think we're talking about enough is we have two potentially triggered parties dealing in a traumatic scenario, whether it's a domestic violence call, whether it's, whatever it might be. Again, like you said, it's one person's worst day. And I just kind of wonder, it just seems like a recipe for potentially bad things to happen. And I've been telling a lot of people, it's amazing we don't see maybe more of it, just because of the psychological state of the parties involved. And I kind of wonder, bringing your social work / policing kind of lens to this, just kind of what do you think about the conversations we're having around these sort of issues?
Shoot, Matt.
Well, you gave me such a good answer to the trauma-informed policing one.
Yeah, this is a big one too, because, I feel like on the surface, we are all very good at, we're good at getting out of certain things. And it's not necessarily because, and I would say we don't get out of things, like our coworkers keep us in check. That's why we're really, really lucky that, law enforcement as a whole, we're a very tight-knit group. And it's because we share in those terrifying experiences together. And then we can talk about it with people who understand what it's like.
Kind of trauma bonding piece.
Yeah. Yeah. And that can be a good and a bad thing. Yeah. And so that's why I make sure to, in my personal life, I honestly, I don't spend a lot of time with my coworkers. I spend a lot of time with people who are not in law enforcement. And it's not because I don't like people in law enforcement. I think it's just because it helps me keep a really healthy balance. So, thinking about what we do when we come together as a traumatized group, right? So I'll give an example. In July, I was on my way to go get coffee, and there was a kid who was running around. He was older. He's like 18 or 19, and he's running around in one of the neighborhoods. I think the information we were getting from dispatch was that he had taken off his shirt, didn't have socks and shoes on. I think he had defecated in someone's front yard, and then he was punching a car. And so one officer went, and I was like, all right, fine, I guess I'll skip my coffee. The interesting thing is some people call it, we get hinky bells. I'm not quite sure. I call it my spidey senses. But as I'm going to this call.
Did you say hinky bells?
Hinky bells.
Not heard that one before.
Well, there's another law enforcement buzz term.
There we go.
But yeah, so the whole time my spidey senses are telling me this doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
So I get there, and my coworker's talking to this guy, and the guy had kind of done some log rolls as I'm walking up, and then he sits crisscross applesauce in the middle of somebody's front yard. And I'm just casually, it's like, I think it was like 7:30 in the morning. It was pretty early. Putting on my gloves, I get one glove on, and this kid springs up, and he goes at my coworker and starts throwing punches. And I was like, what is going on? It took, I had to do a double take of, we don't have these interactions with people that often. Yeah. So it was a whirlwind, and it was, in the moment, it was manageable. I don't know how else to explain it. It's just kind of like your body goes into, this is what I was trained to do. This is how I'm supposed to respond to this situation. And so it gets very robotic, and it's like you're checking off things on a list. Yeah. And then all of a sudden it was over. My knee hurt and I'm out of breath. My hair's crazy and my mask is like off, out of kilter. You know, like I didn't even have time to put on my mask. I had one glove on, you know, like it was
Yeah.
just so out of, it was just everything changes for, it goes from 0 to 60 and we don't always know it. And
Yeah.
so I wouldn't necessarily qualify that as a traumatic experience, but my body reacted so differently that it stuck with me. And it wasn't, you know, like I've been in some terrible situations, and that by far was not high up on a terrible, on, you know. um so I was just, you know, thinking about that, of this man who God only knows what was going on for him. And luckily I work for a department where we are supported in understanding the world in a different way. We don't have those, you know, old school ways of doing some of those things, and of, you know, policing. And to watch my coworker interact with this guy of just like, hey man, he literally, as he gets out of the car, he's like, hey friend, looks like you're having a bad day. What's going on?
Yeah.
You know, that's just how, again, I'm really lucky with the people that I work with, that we are very open. I think a lot of people know that I go see a therapist regularly. I'm really open about that because I've seen some scary, like I've seen some disgusting things. I've seen, you know, things I wouldn't want to wish on anyone. And I've responded one way, and that was not appropriate or healthy. And then now I've taken on these new practices where it is healthy. And so I think, again, it just all falls back to, that situation could have gone way different
Yeah. Yeah.
because of the trauma he brought into the situation, because of my traumatic experiences and my responses to the world. And you know, the fact that I'm not a football player didn't
Yeah.
help me much, but thank goodness, I think my coworker did. So we were able to get that situation under control. Um, but it ended up being just like a medical assist, and we got him the resources he needed. I don't think he thought he was in reality. He
Yeah.
kept saying, we are not part of reality. And so again, if we're, you know, I guess thinking about some of the other stuff too, of, it's not just a matter of like, are you in a state of psychosis? Are you under the influence of something? It's, you know, every single thing, you know, like just the badge on my shirt, the uniform I wear is something that can trigger somebody into a tailspin of horribleness. And I have to know that that's not personal. It wasn't me who put that traumatic response and trigger in that person.
Yeah. Well, that, you know, one of the other things you hear a lot, and I think we need to have, I think words are so important. You know, oftentimes it gets the term defund the police, which really, from the research I've done, is thinking about how we police in a different way. Like I said, I think something that sounds good on the sign, obviously, is sticky and gets people's attention. But one of the calls that you hear from certain groups is to, you know, as part of public safety, to integrate more maybe social work, mental health folks in, and taking some of the, I mean, I think you give a great example of probably what was either a substance abuse, mental health, or both sort of scenario. It sounds so familiar of things I've worked with in my career. And this integration more of maybe folks, and this is kind of how I'm trying to look at it, because you're right that the badge, the uniform is a trigger for so many folks. Again, not having their good best day already, so they're already in their amygdala. It doesn't take much for what might be something I see and I can take a breath and be okay with it. In that worst day, now I'm re-traumatized or what's ever going on. And I just kind of wonder kind of what you think about, you know, maybe diversifying our, if you call it a public safety response, I'm not even sure the right kind of words, of integrating maybe more social work and other folks into the job. And for those of you that might not be in social work, I think you think about a social worker as a fragile flower that if the wind blows the wrong direction, all the puddles. Trust me, and I'm not saying I've been a police officer by any stretch, but working with violent youth and violent populations, I've been bit, I've been spit on, I've been attacked. And I hate restraints, but working in a special education population, it was just a way we had to do to keep them safe. And again, not comparing our experiences in any which way, because I could control the environment where you were walking into an uncontrollable one in a lot of ways. But I just kind of wonder, when you hear these ideas about, hey, maybe we could integrate more social work, mental health into public safety. I just kind of wonder what you're kind of thinking, holding both sides of that equation in your academic experience.
Yeah, and I don't know, defund doesn't really bother me as much as it used to, because I didn't understand the backstory of it all. And I think now how I look at it is right, like what you were saying. I think during one of our conversations, you said, let's just call it a reimagination. Like that sounds more fun too. You got some little Disney Disney forest creatures running around reimagining police departments. That would be great. But I think how it looks to me is like, yes, we do need to look at the big picture and see what is working well and what is not. And I think part of that, in the recent Senate bill change, that was a big thing. And, for some departments, it wasn't that different from what we were already practicing. We don't allow certain things that are not allowed in the legislation. And again, that depends on the department. So the one that I work for, we have already implemented those things. That's been in practice for a long time. And so moving beyond that, kind of outside of that skills part, I think the other part, the good training part, is to implement appropriate de-escalation classes and courses, and how to do that and what it actually looks like and what it should look like. And I think, again, I was really lucky. I was able to take that from my social work practice and my social work education and be able to apply all of that pretty smoothly into what I do already. But that gives us, again, another good basis of like, we're standing here with a social worker who's taking forever. I've been accused of taking forever talking to somebody. I'm like, no, this is a matter of safety. Yeah. And like, we don't necessarily need to move on to the next call right away. We're okay if we take the extra time, because that may mean that we are actually getting them the resources that they need, instead having us go back and re-talk to these people over and over. If I take 15 minutes instead of 5, it's going to make sure that I can get them the resources that they need. And so this is not an original idea by me, but they have, many of the big departments. I know Denver Police Department they've had co-responders. A number of agencies in Arapahoe County have had co-responders, and they all work for Arapahoe Douglas. The one in Arapahoe County, they work for All Health Network, which they are co-responders. They come out, I think it's anywhere from 2 to 5 days a week, and they ride with police officers, and they specifically go to mental health calls. And they are also with police officers when they go to these calls, because, not necessarily that all officers are lacking in that area, but, the All Health Network co-responder is going to have way more understanding, way more resources to rely on in order to make sure that these people are getting what they need out of their interaction with law enforcement and out of first responders. And I think that is a huge way for us to make sure that we ensure that we are following with the Senate bill, but then we're also just being trauma-informed police officers by allowing and delegating these things to other people. Just, I use the analogy because my grandpa was a basketball coach. And I used to say, I don't understand. Why can't every basketball player do a perfect free throw? And he's like, that's not how it works. Every single person, every player.
My dad was a basketball coach. I still can't understand why people can't shoot a perfect free throw.
Well, it's because luckily he explained this. It's because every single player has their specific specialty. You know, you don't want a 5'7" defender. You want Shaquille O'Neal as a defender, and you want the 5-foot guy as, you know, as the point guard,
Yes.
right? And that is the same in law enforcement. We need certain people in certain positions to ensure that these things are going to be done in a way that works best for everybody and has the best possible outcome. And if we limit ourselves to only our police officers, we're probably doing ourselves a disservice in not reaching out to the community and figuring out what works best for everyone. And that spirals me into this whole other thing where we just need to communicate. You know, we need to communicate so much.
Well, and I, just to throw my personal, like, one of the biggest, when I was working with your department, we kind of centered it, we were doing trauma-informed policing and some self-care in there. We were kind of gathering around homelessness as really a focus area within the trauma work. And I just walked away from being, you know, I've done a little work in the criminal justice arena, but it was kind of residential juvenile justice work, which was eye-opening in and of itself, but very different than officers going out on, you know, doing the work that you do. But there was this moment in the training where it was just an epiphany for me, because, you know, as somebody who's been on the service provider, the nonprofit arena, you know, there were, you kind of would a lot of times, and I think this, just to be clear, is in every profession. You've got great people and you've got good people and you've got people that, you know, you don't want to ever see. You know, we would have to call the police, and, you know, we would see some officers come in and de-escalate better than the PhDs could do it. Like they just, how they held themselves, how they interacted. They knew their outside, they knew the power of their, but they were able to use it in a way that when they showed up, we knew that the kid would actually stay in treatment because this would not escalate any further. Sometimes another officer would come and we say, here we go. Like, you know,
not
it's
this
like, we'll just walk them out to your car, you know, just like just pretend everybody hi, nobody's hi, you know, and that's in every profession. But, you know, so I think we have this mixed experience. And I think being, you know, social justice advocates, I think we see systematic racism, not just in policing, but in healthcare and, you know, health disparities and all the educational system and all that. The thing that really struck me is how we've done a horrible job coming together with law enforcement, because the thing that stuck out to me is, you know, some of these officers who I really saw going kind of above and beyond to help, you know, these individuals experiencing chronic homelessness in your community. They said, hey, we would drive them to the shelter, which was kind of 20 minutes away. It wasn't close. But then they're back out on the street the next day. Why don't you help them? And I'm like, oh, we've not talked. Like, and I could answer that question, but the answer to me wasn't important. It's like, well, we can't hold somebody in a shelter against their will. If they want to leave, they can leave. And I'm not saying that the homeless system is adequate, much less great anyway, but, you know, I think everybody's trying to do their best, but it's like, oh, we don't talk. And I think there's so much, you know, and I think this can bubble up to the current social issues that are out there, but on the very, like, we're working together to trying to end homelessness, and yet we don't have a shared language. We haven't communicated what we do. We don't know what your experience with our folks is. And I just think there's so much room for at least conversation, if not partnership, around so many issues. And again, we've got bigger fish to tackle. There'll always be another challenge ahead of us of where we're going. But it's like, to me, there was like so much low-hanging fruit of, you know, let's talk with each other and at least answer your questions and you can answer my questions. And, you know, I wonder how much of that kind of you see as you do, you know, your work, kind of holding both sides of that equation, is just kind of a misunderstanding and a lack of shared language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would agree 100%. And then that was how you and I were initially connected,
Yeah.
was because myself and a couple of my coworkers were tasked with the wonderful, not Nobel Prize winning, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but like we were tasked with ending homelessness in the city.
Yeah.
And I did not get my Nobel Peace Prize yet, and I'm still waiting on it. No, I'm just kidding. I think that, like that was what it boiled down to. Like you and I had so many deep conversations about, I go to this person and I ask them to do this, or, I take someone to the hospital on a mental health hold because they are gravely disabled, and they are literally released from the hospital 4 hours later.
Yeah.
And when they were put on a mandatory 72-hour hold, like what are we, and then it's easy, like I do that and I put the blame on the hospital and the doctors of like, you're not doing your job. And then the doctors, I don't know what their perspective is, but I'm sure that they feel that they've been shorted as well. And so it's this cycle of shortchanged where, where we're just kind of like shuffling people around, not really knowing what to do. And
Mhm.
it seems like the people who are the most important and the most needed are, as a social worker, I think it's really exciting if you get paid over $45,000 a year.
It
And
is.
salary, I think, unfortunately, has a really big impact on it,
Mhm.
because we need to survive.
Yeah.
The people who are keeping the heartbeat of these communities going are not being given the fuel to do it.
Mhm.
And it's not necessarily, like none of us go into social work, law enforcement, any of those jobs thinking, oh goodness, I'm so glad the money is so great. We do it because of the, like what it does for our hearts.
Yeah.
But then if we have the additional, going back to, if we have the added stress of everything that's going on in our personal lives compounded with what we are dealing with at work, and then the the fears of not being able to pay for rent if you're not in a partnered relationship, like we're all going through these communal issues together, and we're not understanding that there's an imbalance. We're just going to go spiraling into all of these things, Matt,
Yeah.
like we normally do, where
Yes.
there's a serious imbalance in this community and in the world as a whole, because we're not lifting the people up that need it the most.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so when we've talked about some of these, but I mean, you can't turn on the news today without someone throwing another idea about reforming the police in some way,
Mhm.
shape, or form. Some of them just seem like no-brainers to me, like trying to diversify police forces. I've always liked the idea of community policing, though I think like a lot of things, one area uses the word and it looks one way, another area uses it looks something very different. But
Mhm.
as somebody who's sort of inside, as all these ideas float around, and I think, I think as the Black Lives Matter movement here in Colorado has actually been realized in major policy changes at the state level. Well, what are some things with your experience, your research, your thinking of, hey, if we were going to just start a department from scratch, what would be some of the real things? How would we build up a trauma-informed community, whatever label you want to put on it, police force? What are some of the issues that really you see, yeah, this could be part of policing moving forward that could really address some of these issues that we're facing?
Mhm. I think just like anything else in the world, um, technology technology is always a big one for me, because it's so, like, to me, I can visualize it. So, like every 6 months, technology changes.
Yeah.
Um, and so after your phone is obsolete, you have to get a new one, right? And it's because of whatever adaptation it is to the world that we have to do. And so, again, I think that's very similar to our jobs. And I started a very basic level. For me, I was torn up about some of the stuff that was going on because I thought, like, I feel like I'm doing enough. I feel like I am being a good enough officer. I got into this for the right reasons. I'm having the conversations with all the right people. So I don't understand what it is that makes me such a terrible person. And it's simply because of the uniform that I wear. And so I think when I finally was able to take a step back, and I was like, okay, Reilly, you're trying to take on the world, and that's great, and that's exciting, and you're doing it for good reasons, but also you need to know that you're one person, and if you have good conversations with other people where you're listening more than speaking, that's where the good work and the change begins. And so I feel like if we still need all of those things, those basic law enforcement skills and training in order to do our jobs effectively. I can't erase that. I think we need to, I'm never going to say if I'm going to a gun or to a call where there is a man with a gun, or a person with a gun actively shooting it, I'm going to have to handle that a certain way. If I go to a call where there's a guy standing on a bridge and he's about to jump, I'm going to handle that in a very different way. And I feel like I need to learn how to put my skills and my education and training into a filing cabinet in order to be like, okay, so I'm on my way to this call. It's a domestic violence call. These are my previous experiences. So I'm going to open my DV drawer and I'm going to reach in there and I'm going to be like, okay, I have to be aware of my own safety. I want to go home tonight, but my number one job is to keep the peace and make sure that the innocence is kept and that we are able to enforce the law in a way that is going to be as peaceful as humanly possible. And I have to take those experiences and keep those in drawers. And recently we've had to open different drawers that may be dusty or rusty or didn't exist before. And the only way for us to navigate those situations is to have constructive conversations with people who matter. And so I've done that recently. I'm lucky that I work in a fairly diverse environment, not as diverse as, like some other areas in the world, but definitely more diverse than
for Colorado.
Colorado. And so recently I've gotten to speak with one individual. She's a woman of color, and she allowed me to bring her up in this conversation. I specifically was like, I'm going to be on a podcast. Can I and she's like, oh yeah, that's totally fine. That's great. Because she's a woman of color. I have a great respect for her. And she and I had I think it was an hour and a half to a 2-hour conversation about her personal experiences, about her fears for her son, and about what it means looking forward of what we're going to do different. And so I asked her during that conversation, I said, what would you do if you were just randomly approached by somebody who said, you matter to me? And she was like, well, that matter, or that, it depends on who the person is. Do I know them? And I was like, yes. And she said, well, if someone I knew came up to me and said, you matter, I would say, okay, thanks. What are you going to do about it? And so she gave me permission to stand up for her and anyone like her if I were in a situation where I needed to be, and she wasn't present. Wow. So I was like, okay, cool. I can definitely handle that.
Yeah.
And then conversely, I said, all right, so what if it's someone you don't know and they come up to you and they say, you matter to me? And she's like, well, that's very funny because this has happened to me recently. And she's so wonderful. I love her. She's hilarious. She's like, so I was in the grocery store, picking out some peaches, and this lady next to me, she was looking at her peaches, and then we were talking about peaches, and out of nowhere, she goes, you matter to me. And she was like, it was awesome. It was great. And, for me, for a really long time, I was like, I feel like if I said that to somebody, it's purely based on what they look like. Yeah. And that in itself feels like what it's going against. It's like because I'm just interacting with someone based on my assumption about who they are. And she said, no way, like, that's totally fine. And you don't even have to go that far. And you could just give somebody a hearty hello or good morning.
Yeah.
And that in itself is showing that person that they are a person in your life.
Right.
And then you can expand upon that. And what it all boils down to, and after hours and hours of like wrestling with it, I just want to be able to love people and respect people. And if I'm not doing that, I have to give other people the permission to tell me that I'm not doing that, and call me out. I don't want to get stuck in bad practices just like anywhere else. And again, that falls under that umbrella of trauma-informed policing. We just need to listen more and talk less and learn people's stories, learn their lives, and see that, okay, I see this person in front of me, but they've had 15, 25, 45, 85 years of every little thread that they've brought with them into this situation. And that's such a beautiful thing. I love learning about people, and I have just like this insatiable appetite for learning about people's stories and their worlds and where they come from. And I wish that we could teach that. Yeah. I don't know how, I haven't figured it out, but if I had to, I would say that would be another basis for how we would create this fantastic police department where we could simultaneously be comfortable with our own discomfort, but also be willing to be open-minded to what's around us.
Yeah. Well, and it's that level of vulnerability that I think, as white people, we are called to really, look at, again, I don't wear a uniform or carry a gun, but like still as a white male, I've got stuff to look at, and if I don't have anything to look at, I need to look a little deeper because there's something there, we talked about when I first heard like defund the police, I was like, wait a minute, no. But then, like you said, we both then researched it. Again, the term is designed to get people like us thinking about it. And then coming the realization is, hey, the worst interaction I've had with a police officer is getting a speeding ticket. And that's my white privilege is my father never had to have the conversation with me that my sister who's raising two black boys has to have with her boys. And I think if we bring that vulnerability and understanding, and I think the worst thing we can do, which is what I see at some levels, and not at all am I speaking of your department, who I found very open. They had me in to train. So they had the hippie boy come in and talk trauma, peace, love, but like we're like, it's like we're trying to create a boxing ring to go after each other. And I think a lot of that has to do with our political environment. And it makes it harder for that vulnerability, really to come in and us to take a look at, okay, how can we do kind of what you were saying? How can we be open to that piece? And I think that's a great challenge, not just for police officers, but for all of us as society as well, because we're going to have to communicate. And, like I said, for the folks like us who come from that white privilege, we can't wait for someone else to create a room for us to come in. Like you said, we have to go into the room if it's created, but, open up those conversations and be vulnerable to sometimes hear things about how people like us have treated other people, and realize that and take a look in the mirror and find that privilege. Mm-hmm. Any other, like in this, and I've loved this conversation, do you see any other thoughts you want to leave, as this is like episode like 125 and I finally got you on, any other words of wisdom for our audience, but before we leave? This has been such a great conversation.
Yeah. I think when it all boils down to it, I feel like we all just need to learn each other. And, I was taught a long time ago to, when you interact with somebody, and maybe it's not the same for all cultures or what have you, but it's symbolic of when you interact with somebody, you should know the color of their eyes by the time you leave that conversation. And it, again, it may not be their eyes. It may be anything significant about that person that gives value, to have them know that they have given value to your life, and vice versa. And if we let the fog roll in and we get overwhelmed by what we can't see or understand, or, all of those things, we're selling ourselves short. And we need to make sure that no matter what we are, no matter what race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religious background, any of those things, I think we all need to kind of start going into these interactions with people not with our fists clenched. And we need to understand that the world is full of a lot of good. And if we don't, if we push that aside and we make it too complex and too complicated, the point has been lost. And I think we just need to love on each other.
Excellent. Great last words. So Officer Reilly, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for our audience. As always, you can find show notes at traumainformedlens.org. Thank you so much, my friend. Maybe I'll get to have you back before 2 more years goes by. So
I love it.
I knew this would be a really informative conversation, and I just appreciate you and the work and the advocacy that you do.
Likewise. Thanks, Matt.